Okay, so we've got this worksheet, every single argument that's on this worksheet, and with 6 and 7 we have things that aren't quite arguments, but they're asking us to make some sort of inference. They're all in natural language. In order to use our propositional logic tools on these, we have to get it into propositional language, not formal language, first. So let's look at the first one on this. Before we get into doing the truth tables, let's first just make sure that we've translated everything accurately into our formal language. Number 1 says, if fossil fuel combustion continues at its present rate, then we'll have to implement geoengineering strategies, or else sea levels will rise. We must not implement geoengineering strategies. Therefore, if fossil fuel combustion continues at its present rate, then sea levels will rise. How do you do this? It seems like we have 2 premises, right? 2 premises and a conclusion. What's my first premise? If fossil fuel combustion continues at its present rate, what letter should I use for that? C for combustion? F for fossil fuels? Let's do F for, it sounds like most people are doing F for fossil. We'll do yours next time. F for fossil fuels. If fossil fuel combustion continues at its present rate, that's an independent proposition right there. So if F, then what? Then we'll have to implement geoengineering strategies, or else sea levels will rise. So it's if this, then some complex thing, right? Some parentheses, and then what's inside the parentheses? Geoengineering strategies. So G, we'll have to implement geoengineering strategies, or S, sea levels or else sea levels will rise. So yeah, there's my first premise. My second premise, and I'm going to do it vertically instead. We know to do the truth table, you're going to want to stack them up like this. First premise, and then second premise, and then third if there is one, and then conclusion eventually. Set off, oh, why did I do that? Set off with a double backslash. But because we're going to have a whole bunch to put on the board here, I'm going to do them vertically so we can fit more of them. So that's premise number 1. Premise number 2 is we must not implement geoengineering strategies. How do you want to represent that? Not G, right? Yeah, it's not the case. Or when we say we must not, we're saying like, let's have it so that this isn't even an option. So not G. Therefore, if fossil fuel combustion continues at its present rate, then sea levels will rise. That looks like pretty much if F, then S. Is that what you guys got as well? Cool. Get you a worksheet, Will. There you go. Okay, so we're asked to go from here to tell it whether or not this argument is valid, which means I'd have to do with truth table. And if you have already done that, awesome. You're a little bit ahead. Let's move on to the next one, though, just so that we can focus on just doing the translations. So number 2 says, we can know that water once flowed on the Martian surface if we find dried-up riverbeds on Mars. We haven't found any dried-up riverbeds. Therefore, we can't know that water once flowed on the Martian surface. What's that first premise? Looks like an if-then, right? But it's a weird if-then. It's been all kind of jumbled out of order. What's the if part? If we find dried-up riverbeds. What do you want to call that? James, it's your turn. What do you want to call that?
R for riverbeds.
R for riverbeds? I had D for dried up, but like, sure there. R for riverbeds. At least the next one's not going to conflict with it. So R for riverbeds. If we find dried up riverbeds on Mars, then what?
W.
Yeah, then W, we know that water once flowed on the Martian surface. So if R, then W. That's my first premise. What's my second premise? It looks like we haven't found any dried up riverbeds. So yeah, whatever R was, yeah, not that. Therefore, we can't know that water once flowed from the Martian surface. Is that W? Is it W or is it not W?
Not W.
It's not W. Okay. All right. So yeah, there's that argument. And again, we want to know whether or not that's valid. We can use the truth table to tell. We can also do some other stuff. If you remember what we did early on with deduction, you might be able to look at some of these and say to yourself, like, yeah, that one, what do you think? Is this one valid? I don't think it's going to make it. That looks an awful lot like denying the antecedent, which we've seen before. This one might work, but it's a kind of like a fancy version of like a couple of different moves all squished into one. A truth table would be able to settle it, though. Moving on to number 3. Either Einstein won the Nobel Prize for his work on the theory of special relativity, or Michelson won it for determining the speed of light. Yes?
I'm sorry, I had a question about number 1.
About number 1? Yeah, sure. Let's go back to number 1.
The way it was worded, made me think that the conclusion was saying you must not implement the geoengineering strategy.
That made you think that the conclusion was we must not implement geoengineering strategies. I think probably the thing that would discourage me from that interpretation of this is to notice that the very next sentence starts with therefore. And so it's kind of like, oh, yeah, maybe that's... I might have been thinking that, like, yeah, we must... what was it? Not G? That maybe that was my conclusion. It's going to be tough to draw that conclusion from just this premise. So if that was the argument that was being made, we might say, like, that looks like a really weak argument. But this and this together, therefore this... Now this starts to look a little bit more plausibly like the intended conclusion. It's certainly true that you can reinterpret it to make anything a possible conclusion, but I would, like, for example, you could say, like, I think this was the intended conclusion. And maybe that's how the person meant it. They just said it really weird for meaning that. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, definitely stop and check with yourself because the conclusion isn't always going to come last. Sometimes people put it, you can put it anywhere, and sometimes it's even a good idea to put it first. It's a very transparent way of letting your audience know, like, this is what I'm trying to argue too. Now watch me argue. But this one, I think we got a pretty clear indicator word with that therefore on that last statement. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. And then 2, we're all cool on 2. And then 3 has to do with Einstein and Albert Michelson. So yeah, how do you want to do this one? Either Einstein won the Nobel Prize for special relativity, or Michelson won it for determining the speed of light. That's an or statement, right? What are the 2 disjuncts? E for Einstein, M for Michelson? Either Einstein won it for special relativity or Michelson won it for the speed of light. Einstein didn't win the Nobel Prize for his work on theory of special relativity. So whatever E was, not E. But he did win the Nobel Prize for his work on the photoelectric effect. A different premise or same premise? We talked about this before. But is and, right? But it's a somewhat surprising and. It's and that like ran the other direction that you were expecting. But it's still just an and. So Einstein didn't win it for special relativity, but, which basically just means and with a little bit of stink. But he did win it for his work on the photoelectric effect. So what do you want to call that? Yeah.
I had a question
About how to, well, let's get it. So what should it be? P? Not E? Einstein did win it for the photoelectric effect? Because we've already made E, he won it for special relativity, right? And then here, not E is he didn't win it for special relativity. He did win it for something else. We need a different letter, right? Because it's a different proposition. And so, yeah, maybe P for photoelectric effect. Yeah, James.
Is that at all relevant to the argument?
Oh, we'll find out. Yeah, maybe it's a hanger on. Maybe it doesn't do any actual work for us. Sometimes people talk like that. Therefore, Michelson won the Nobel Prize for determining the speed of light. Therefore, M. Is that what you guys got as well? Yeah, and as you will find out, that P doesn't, and we saw this in our syllogistic logic as well, too. P isn't connecting E to anything, right? Yeah, so I want to somehow get from stuff that I know about E to stuff that I know about M, because my conclusion is M, and P doesn't really connect E to anything, so maybe it's just trivia. Some people just said not E. They were like, that was the only interesting part, was not E anyway. What we'll find out when we're doing our natural deduction style strategies on these is that maybe you want to start with exactly what you're told, and we'll recognize that if not E and P is true, it's a really short trip to just saying not E, right? If I ate an apple and I ate a pizza, then you can say like, oh, so you ate a pizza. And I'm like, yes. That will always be true, right? A and B, therefore A. Or A and B, therefore B will always work. So yeah, it's a short trip to this. Some folks maybe just went straight for it and didn't include this at all. I'll recommend if what we're trying to do is practice translating from natural language to our formal language, do it exactly right first. And then know that like this is an option that's going to be available to you. Cool? Yeah, so this is going to end up being what's doing the work here. Because I have E or M and then not E, therefore M. That looks an awful lot like our old friend disjunctive syllogism. In fact, that is a disjunctive syllogism. 4. By the way, one of the things that we're doing here is we're going to be using truth tables like if what you end up recognizing that like this is essentially just doing the work of a disjunctive syllogism. I told you that disjunctive syllogisms were always valid. I explained it, maybe you believed me. Do a truth table for this and you'll have proved that disjunctive syllogism is always valid. Number 4, a robot is conscious only if it, only if. Only if. What a fun little phrase only if is. A robot is conscious only if it has subjective experience. How did you handle this one? That's something like an if, right? A robot is conscious, you want to call that C for conscious? A robot is conscious only if it has subjective experience. Let's call that S for subjective experience. Is it that? Is it that? Is it both? Is it an or between the two? What's going on here? What's only if? Yes? You had if S then C. And this is what we think it means to say a robot is conscious only if it has subjective experience. Anybody say if C then S? A couple of people said if C then S. How are we going to figure out which one is right? They definitely don't mean the same thing.
The robot being conscious is contingent on it having subjective experience.
But it's not the same as saying a robot is conscious if it has subjective experience, right? If I said if a robot has subjective experience, then it's conscious. Is that what I mean when I say a robot is conscious only if it has subjective experience? Think about it this way, too. If I say, I'm going to bring if it rains, then I'll bring my umbrella. Does that mean that I'll bring my umbrella only if it rains? What does I'll bring my umbrella only if it rains mean? Let's figure something out real quick on this. If true, then true is?
True.
If true, then false is? If false, then true is true. If false, then false is false. True, then true is true. If false, then true is true. If true, then false is false. And if false, then false is true. In which of these would we say that the robot is conscious only if it has subjective experience? So C is true only when S is true. Is that what we're trying to say? So which of these two has that? C is true only when S is true. Keep in mind, some of these statements have to end up being false, right? The whole statement on this line is true. The whole statement on this line is false. So that one doesn't count. The whole statement ends up being false if this is the case, right? If C is true and S is false, then we say the whole statement was false. But we're trying out a premise that we're going to assume is true in order to tell if the argument's valid. So all of my false statements, let's just cross those guys out. Those are ones that we can't put forward as premises because we know that they're not going to be true. So now, which of these tells me that a robot is conscious only if it has subjective experience? So C is only true when S is true. This one, right? C is true, S is true, and C is never true again. Here, C is true, S is true, but C is true and F is false is a possibility, right? And it's because on this line, we're going from false to true, false antecedent to true consequent instead of true antecedent to false consequent. So yeah, that's the one that means only if, right? C only if S. This is my guy. And that one is not what I mean. Does it make sense how we figured that out? Also, if you're maybe a little bit confused about that or don't feel like doing a truth table every single time you want to translate only if, just remember that only if does the conditional backwards. For like if you thought it was if, for example, let's say C, so if I said something like S if C is if C then S. That makes perfect sense, right? C only if S. It makes it look like it's the if S, but when I have only if, just think of it going backwards. So the if is going to jump to the other term. So C only if S should translate, you should do an instantaneous translation for yourself from this to if C then S. Does that make sense? Okay. That's a whole lot of work just to get our first premise. A robot is conscious only if it has subjective experience. Boom. Robots do have subjective experience, or they are merely executing a program. So S or P for program. Bless you. Cough you. That doesn't sound very nice. Get yourself under control. Please don't die. Whatever. Therefore, if a robot is merely executing a program, then it's not conscious. Yeah. P, if it's merely executing a program, then it is not conscious. I'm starting to get into some philosophical territory here. Like this is starting to look like a genuine argument that I'm scratching my head. I'm like, wow, is that true? Like I might have learned something from that one. Okay. Number 5. If the soul lives on after the body dies, then it must not be a material entity. What do you want for the soul lives on after the body dies? S for soul? Soul lives on after the body dies? Then it must not be a material entity. So not M for material entity or E for entity, perhaps. If a soul can engage in sensory perception, if P, then it must be a material entity. So not M was it's not a material entity. M is going to be it is a material entity. Therefore, provided that, boy, there's another fun one. Provided that, that's kind of like an if then too, right? Provided that the soul lives on after the body dies, it cannot engage in sensory perception. Is that if S then not P? Or is it if not P then S? Yes, provided that and only if. Only if is it's a version of if. So what is, think about it. I'm going to say two things. Tell me if they mean the same thing. If the soul lives on after the body dies, then it can't engage in sensory perception. Provided that the soul lives on after the body dies, it cannot engage in sensory perception. Did those two things mean the same thing? You guys are all looking at me like I got a booger or something.
Say it again.
I'll do it in the opposite order this time. Provided that the soul lives on after the body dies, it cannot engage in sensory perception. That's what's on your worksheet. Let me say this other one. Tell me if it means the same thing. If the soul lives on after the body dies, then it cannot engage in sensory perception. Some people are like, yeah. Some people are like, no. Let's do a truth table, find out. If true, then false is false. If true, then true is true. If false, then false is true. If false, then true is true. This line goes, right? I get rid of this line. It's going to make this premise, or sorry, it's going to make this conclusion false, but I'm concerned with what it means when it's true. So, provided that the soul lives on after the body dies, it cannot engage in sensory perception. Provided that S is true, P is going to end up being true. No, not P is going to end up being true, right? Provided that S is true, not P is going to end up being true. Versus the other way around, right? Provided that not P, or not P, provided that S. Maybe we mean it that way. Provided that S is true, not P ends up being true. When S is true, not P is false. When S is true, not P is true. It's this one, right? This is the one that gets me at what it is that I'm trying to say. So it's if S, then not P. That's number 5. I'm fairly certain about this. He said, pretending like he was less certain than he actually is. That's the answer. Yeah, Sean. Before I erase these? Yeah, okay, so I'm trying to get a sense of what does this statement is saying something in natural language, right? That's kind of conveying a meaning to me, and I'm trying to figure out what is the formal language version of this. And one of the ways that I'm going to be able to check this is I'll do I'll do all of my possible formal language translations, and I'll make truth tables for them, and that'll show me what it is that I'm trying to say when that statement is true. And I can match that up against what the natural language statement is trying to say as well. So on this one, I'm going to cross out all the ones where the whole statement ends up being false, because it's being put forward as true in natural language. So we're saying, provided that the soul lives on after the body dies, that was S. Provided that S, it cannot engage in sensory perception. Provided that S, not P. And I'm wondering, does that mean if S, then not P, or does it mean if not P, then S? Well, I guess there's really no way around it without using words like necessity and sufficiency. We're looking at necessary or sufficient conditions. So the question here is all right, is S going to be a sufficient condition for not P, or is not P going to be the sufficient condition for S? Provided that seems like it's offering me a sufficient condition, right? This is going to happen provided that this other thing happens. The provided that tells me the thing that I'm saying, provided that, blah, 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 that's a sufficient condition for the first thing. So is that a sufficient condition? Provided that S is true, will not P be true? Well, S is true here, and not P is true, and then S is never true again. So this state of affairs that we have here with this truth table, minus the false line, tells me that, yeah, provided that S is true, not P ends up being true. That's not quite how it flies over here when I do if not P, then S. Provided that S is true, not P is going to end up being true. Well, S is true here, but not P is false on that same line. S is true and not P is true, so sometimes S being true makes not P true, sometimes it doesn't. So that doesn't seem to get at the same thing that I'm trying to say when I say, provided that the soul lives on after the body, it cannot engage in sensory perception. This one represents that idea, and this one not so much. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. And are we all pretty clear on how to turn each of these arguments into a truth table and use the truth table to tell whether or not the argument's valid or invalid? Cool. 6 and 7 are a little weird, though, on this worksheet, right? Let's take a look at those and see what's happening. I'll come back over here. Because they're not really offering us arguments and then asking whether or not they're valid. This one it's doing something slightly different. We have testimony from 3 different people on question number 6. Cindy, Jane, and Amanda, who all witnessed a bank robbery, and they all tell us a little something about what they saw. The question that we're being asked about this is it even possible that all 3 witnesses are telling the truth? And if so, what sorts of things, if it was possible that they were all telling the truth, provided that they are telling the truth, what else could we know about what was going on? So let's start with what Cindy had to say. Cindy testified that Lefty did not enter the bank, and if Howard pulled a gun, then Conrad collected the money. What a terrible witness Cindy is. Put her on the stand and you're like, what did you see, Cindy? And she says, well, I'll tell you this. Lefty did not enter the bank, and if Howard pulled a gun, then Conrad collected the money. No further questions, Your Honor. You may go, Cindy. But all right, so what is Cindy saying here? She's saying Lefty didn't enter the bank. Want to call that one not L for Lefty did not enter the bank? That might get us in trouble later, but well, let's stick with it for now. And if Howard pulled a gun, then Conrad collected the money. And in parentheses, right? Not L and Howard did pull a gun and, oh, if Howard pulled a gun, then Conrad collected the money. That's Cindy's testimony right there. You guys agree? All right, good. Jane tells us that if Howard did not pull a gun, then Lefty entered the bank. So if Howard did not pull a gun, then Lefty did enter the bank. Has Cindy contradicted Jane? Have they said different things yet? Yeah, they have? Cindy said Lefty did not enter the bank and some other stuff. Jane said if Howard didn't pull the gun, is that what it was? If Howard didn't pull a gun, then Lefty didn't enter the bank. Or then Lefty did enter the bank. But that's not necessarily contradicting what Cindy said just yet. Last but not least, Amanda says that if Conrad collected the money, then Howard pulled the gun. If Conrad collected the money, then Howard did pull the gun. Okay. This is what they're saying. Can all these three things be true at the same time? How are you going to figure that out? I'll give you a hint. It starts with a T, and it ends in uth able. It rhymes with uth table. If not H, then L. If C, then H. How many different terms do I have going on here? 3, right? I have L, C, and H, or L, H, and C. How many lines is this going to end up being? 8. All right, so 4. Do this as fast as I can, because I know this is the most boring part. Let's take out all of our negations first. Those are going to have to be done right away. So instead of L, we have not L, so reverse everything here. And we got a not H over here, so we've got to negate everything there. If H then C for this whole column is going to be column out as I point to them. This one is true. This one is false. And then true, 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 false, true, true. That'll make, woof, this is a big one. I have a big conjunction here where this is one conjunct and this is the other conjunct. They both have to be true, right? So yeah, false, 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 true, false, true, true. Okay, so that's this guy. In fact, I'll do him in red so I don't get confused. That's, who is that? Cindy's testimony? It's true on this line, false on that line, etc. If not H, then L. False, then true is true, 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 true. Ah, there we go. False and false. There is Jane's testimony. And Amanda's testimony is if C, then H. True, true, false, true, 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 false, true. What were we asked first about this? Oh, Sean, question. Did I drop something? Where? Which one? Underneath the and symbol, what line?
Yeah, right there.
Line 1? Quite. Thank you. That should be false. Good looking out. What was the first thing they asked us about this? Is it possible that they're all telling the truth? Is it possible that they're all telling the truth? On line 1? Nope. Cindy had to be lying. Was Cindy first? Yeah, Cindy was lying. Cindy was lying, Cindy was lying, Cindy was lying. Cindy's telling the truth. Looks like Cindy's the hardest sell here. So line 5, 7, and 8 are good for Cindy. Line 5 is good for Jane. And, yeah, for Amanda as well. It is possible they're all telling the truth. Is it possible on any other line? Nope, nope, nope. Only on this line are they all telling the truth. So what does that tell me? Never asked if there was a valid argument. What's the conclusion? Not really drawn a conclusion. I just have Cindy says something, Jane says something, Amanda said something, and we're wondering, like, could they all be telling the truth? Or are some of them contradicting one another? They could all be telling the truth, but only under these conditions. And what are these conditions? L is false. What was L? Lefty didn't go, or L was, Lefty did go into the bank, right?
Yes, or did not in the bank.
Yeah, so L has to be false in order for them to all be telling the truth. So that means Lefty, if they're all telling the truth, then Lefty did not go into the bank. What was H? Howard did pull the gun. That's true. And then C? Conrad did collect the money. So if they're all telling the truth, then Lefty did not go into the bank, Howard did pull the gun, and Conrad did collect the money. This is a pretty clever little trick there. If they were all telling the truth, then this would have to be the case. Or somebody's lying, right? So if you could imagine, if you were a lawyer, you know, like making this big grand truth table for the jury and saying, like, so as we can see, ladies and gentlemen, provided that everybody's telling the truth, which is a fancy way of saying if everybody's telling the truth, if everybody's telling the truth, then this is going to have to be the case. Yes?
How do you know Howard pulled the gun versus Howard didn't pull the gun? Which one of those is true?
How do I know? Well, it seems like I said H was Howard does pull the gun, and not H is Howard doesn't pull the gun. So H here is, it has to, the only possibility for H where all of my testimonies are true, are truthful ones, has H being true. So that means Howard did pull the gun. Does that make sense? Number 7 is a very similar sort of approach, right? It's like multiple statements. I ask, is it possible that they're all true? And if it was possible that they're all true, if it is in fact true that they're all those statements are true, what would have to be the case? Similar sort of setup, using the truth table, but not seeking out validity, looking for a line where all of the statements are true, and then checking back over to say, like, what were those conditions under which everything was true? How you feeling about this stuff? Like we're done, maybe? Like you're okay not having me talk about truth tables anymore in class? It'll show up on an exam, but you won't get any more instruction regarding truth tables from me. We'll move on to natural deduction a week from now when we get back. Enjoy your Easter holiday thing long weekend, and I'll see you guys when I see you.